Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 10. Road Trip. The road trip that Nick had promised seemed to be doomed before it had even started. Telly had left Alder and Batan alone in the bullpen for a total of 5 minutes to grab her overnight bag from her locker, and when she returned, the two women were stuck in a heated argument about who was going to drive. At first, Telly found it completely hilarious and was fighting really hard to bite back a laugh. But when after a while, more and more people started to look in their direction, and neither of the women showed any indication of backing down, she was starting to get impatient. Telly cleared her throat, quietly at first, but then more vigorous, only to receive absolutely no reaction. The arguing continued, and Tally's patience shrunk. She rolled her eyes and let out a loud sigh that still went by completely unnoticed. Frustration started to build up inside of her. 7 hours stuck in a car with these two? Now that was going to be fun. Telly listened to the bickering for a little while longer and contemplated her options, which were in fact quite limited. She didn't want to cause a scene, and definitely wasn't planning on getting into the argument by favoring any of the two squabblers, which ultimately led her to the conclusion that there was only one way to end this without picking a side. It was dangerous, reckless even, potentially one of the bravest things Telly had done in her life so far, but it needed to be done. And if she wouldn't act soon, chances were high they would still be standing there the next morning. So, Telly took one last deep breath, braced herself, and strode directly between the two arguing women. Without giving any of them the chance to even process what was happening, she quickly grabbed the keys that were still lying on Alder's desk and wheeled them in front of her, like a trophy. "I am driving." There was a brief moment of silence, but the stoic expression on Tally's face and the harsh tone of her voice seemed to surprise both women so much that the arguing stopped. Finally. And the look of utter confusion on Alder's and Batan's faces was so hilarious that it took Telly every last ounce of self-control not to break character. But she managed. She turned on her heel without sparing the two women as much as another glance, and walked towards the parking lot, leaving two very astonished detectives behind. When she was out of sight, a triumphant grin appeared on her face. Craven 1. Grumpy detectives with a slightly unhealthy way of communicating? 0. To Tally's surprise, Alder and Batan had actually managed to grab their stuff without starting another fight, and joined her in the parking lot only minutes later. This only encouraged her to pull through with her tactic, and before either of them had time to make a comment, Tally nodded at Batan firmly and pointed at the back of the car. "Batan, you sit in the back." Then she turned towards Alder and gestured at the passenger seat. "Alder, you can sit here. Any more arguments and you can both walk to Washington. Is that clear?" She felt like she was talking to a bunch of 12-year-olds, but couldn't say she wasn't enjoying her newly found authority, and it seemed to work. Neither of the two tried to argue with her decision. Alder even looked like she was resisting the urge to pout, which might have been one of the most adorable things Telly had ever seen. Batan mumbled something incomprehensible that Tally was glad she couldn't understand properly, and only bothered to raise her voice slightly once she had made herself comfortable in the back seat. "I'm not sure if I like this side of you, Red," but I'm pretty sure she does. She nudged her head in Alder's direction, who didn't take the bait, but instead rolled her eyes slightly, but then unconsciously bit her lip in a way that made Tally's stomach flutter. Tally turned around quickly before the blush on her cheeks would become too noticeable and would ruin anything she had just managed to build up. Then she quickly climbed into the driver's seat, following Alder's example of ignoring Baton's teasing for as long as possible. Once the three were settled down, Tally had started the engine and drove the car towards the highway. There was quite a bit of traffic, and Tally definitely wasn't the best driver, but both Alder and Batan were suspiciously quiet. Tally knew it was definitely not because they were so intimidated by her authority or impressed with her driving. Instead, they were probably already coming up with reasons to pick up yet another fight. Tally decided not to wait that long. There would be no point in arguing if they wouldn't be able to hear each other, right? So she glanced at the two other detectives. "Does any of you mind if I turn up the music?" She didn't wait for a reply and simply pressed the volume button until Kelly Clarkson's "Since You've Been Gone" was blasting through the car on full volume. Tally smiled and could feel how the music improved her mood even further. Oh, damn. She loved that song. She started to hum along to the tunes, quietly at first, but then louder. Maybe that road trip was not going to be a full disaster after all. For once, she couldn't care less about what Alder and Batan were thinking about her. They had a 7-hour-long drive ahead of them, and the least that Tally could do was to make it as enjoyable for her as possible. So soon enough, she was singing along to the radio from the top of her lungs. She couldn't help but let out a surprised chuckle when after a couple of minutes she could hear Batan's voice from the back seat, joining in on her singing. Tally decided that it was best not to comment on this and to just roll with the moment, so that's exactly what she did when she raised her voice even further and tried to match the high note that Batan had just delivered. Tally had no idea what station they were listening to, but it definitely did not disappoint and hit them with one powerful love ballad after the next. She was almost ashamed that she knew the lyrics to all of them by heart, but it was weirdly reassuring that Detective Batan seemed to be right there with her. Tally kept her eyes focused on the street in front of her, but at some point couldn't resist the urge to turn her head slightly and look at Alder in the passenger seat. When her eyes fell on the older woman, she barely managed to conceal a loud snort because of the contradictory image in front of her. Alder did her best to appear completely indifferent to their singing. She was sitting up straight in her seat and was busily staring out of the window. Still, Tally noticed a slight nodding of her head and the way her fingers tabbed on her thighs, following the beat of the song. Also, she could have sworn she had seen Alder's lips quietly mumbling along when she caught a quick glance of her reflection in the window. Well, considering her liking for romance books, it was probably a logical consequence that Alder was also familiar with the corresponding music. Still, for some reason, it amused Tally to no end. The traffic was finally getting less and the time passed quickly. However, when they finally reached the FBI headquarters, it was already mid-afternoon. Tally couldn't feel her butt anymore and was more than ready to finally get out of this car. Behind her, Detective Batan groaned, obviously sharing her pain. "Oh, damn. I don't think I can move my legs anymore. I cannot wait to get out of here." "Can't argue with that," Alder chimed in. Tally let out a dry laugh. "Now that's a first. Who would have thought that all it took to get you two to agree on something would be 7 hours in a car? I would have suggested this much sooner." She didn't even need to turn around to know that Detective Batan was rolling her eyes at her. Well, that was a nice change for once, and one she could definitely get used to. Alder, on the other hand, actually let out a low chuckle that made Tally grin at her in response. She quickly shifted her focus back to parking their car, and minutes later the three finally made it out of the vehicle, stretching themselves in an attempt to loosen up their stiff muscles. Then they made their way towards the large building opposite the parking lot. It looked incredibly modern, mainly consisted of large glass fronts, and was surrounded by a big metal fence to avoid unauthorized entering. To Tally, it all felt incredibly cold and high profile, as if the main goal was to intimidate, rather than to help the people in need. This wasn't her world at all, and she was suddenly very glad that she hadn't continued her training in order to become a federal agent. The only entrance was guarded by a bulky man in uniform that was busier with his phone than with checking the credentials of the three detectives. It took 2 vigorous coughs of Alder to finally get him to notice them, and he definitely did not seem pleased that he was interrupted to actually do what he was paid for. After what felt like an eternity, they had finally made it through another security check and were allowed to enter the elevator that would bring them directly to Mr. Silver's office. They had to hand in their weapons downstairs, and despite the fact that they were in one of the safest buildings in the world, it left Tally with an uneasy feeling. The elevator pinged. Tally told herself to pull it together once more and followed Alder and Batan out of the metal box and into a small room. Tally took in the room in front of her, which seemed to be the front room of Mr. Silver's office. It fits the aesthetic of the rest of the building and was bare of any personal touches. There was a large glass desk standing in front of the window. Behind it, a small woman, that Tally estimated to be around 60 years old, was busy typing something on her computer. Opposite the desk were 3 black leather armchairs and a water automat, and to the right, a potted plant that had definitely seen better days. The whole atmosphere was cold and tense, and Tally would have given anything to exchange it for the easy and relaxed moments that she and the other 2 detectives had shared in the car not even an hour ago. For now, Tally decided to linger in the back and leave the stage to Alder and Batan, who at that moment raised her voice to introduce them. "Excuse me." The older woman at the desk, probably Mr. Silver's secretary, looked up and smiled at them with way more warmth than Tally would have expected from someone who was working in a place as cold as this. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear you come in. You must be detectives from Boston, right?" Alder and Batan nodded in unison, and the woman continued speaking. "My name is Mrs. Gibson. I'm Mr. Silver's secretary. He's almost done with his phone conference and will have time for you in a moment. Can I offer you anything to drink?" The 3 women declined politely. "Then please, at least take a seat while you wait." But before any of them had the chance to move, the door to the office was pushed open, and a man in his late 50s stepped into the room. Tally recognized Blanton Silver immediately. He was tall, had dark blonde, gelled hair that was already starting to turn gray, and was wearing a suit that was probably more expensive than anything Tally had ever owned. The man immediately put on a huge smile that didn't reach his eyes, then extended his hand to shake Alder's. "Detective Alder, it is truly a pleasure to see you again." Tally couldn't help but notice that this was quite a curious thing to say to the detective who'd been investigating the murder of his daughter. There also was something in the way Silver mustered Alder that totally creeped her out. It was as if he was taking her in with a strange, almost predatory fascination. If Alder had also noticed his intense staring, she hid it well. Instead, she smiled back politely, diplomatically, and without any real emotion, and shook Silver's hand. "Mr. Silver, I'm glad that you could make the time to see us." He nodded, then turned his body towards Detective Batan to greet her as well. His eyes, however, kept shifting in Alder's direction. "And you must be Detective Batan. I've heard a lot about you. You have quite the reputation." "Only good things, I hope." "Certainly." "Well, what can I say? My reputation precedes me." Silver let out a dry laugh and was about to reply when he noticed Tally, who was still standing slightly behind the 2 older women. He frowned, and for a split second, his eyes turned stone cold. "Now who is that?" It was obvious that he hadn't expected a 3rd detective, and the man made no effort to hide his displeasure about Tally's presence. Tally immediately stood just a little taller. If there was something she truly couldn't stand, then it was being down-talked by men simply because they were in a position of authority. She was about to give him a not very polite reply when she felt Alder leaning back slightly, gently touching her wrist, wordlessly holding her back. "She is my partner." At Alder's words, something that looked like curiosity flashed over Silver's face. "But other than that, nobody you should be concerned about." Usually words like that would make Tally even madder, but there was something in Alder's voice that made Tally pause. Something that she hadn't heard before. She sounded protective, and at the same time quite dismissive, as if she really wanted to take Silver's focus away from Tally. It seemed like he was not only creeping Tally out, and that was something she didn't really know how to deal with. She could still feel Silver's gaze on her and shivered involuntarily. There was another brief moment of silence. Then Detective Batan finally broke the tension that was slowly starting to feel rather uncomfortable. She nodded towards Silver's office. "Now shall we?" Tally was about to follow the others into the room when her eyes once more landed on Silver's secretary. She seemed to busy herself with paperwork again, but something in the way she was holding herself told Tally that she had followed the exchange attentively. Just at that moment, the older woman looked up, and for a second her gaze met Tally's. She couldn't really explain why. It was barely more than a gut feeling, but something in her eyes made Tally hesitate. She took a moment to consider her approach, but quite frankly, Alder and Batan definitely didn't need her help when they would interrogate Silver, and she had no interest in being made responsible when the two women ended up in another argument. If she was completely honest, she also wasn't looking forward to spending more time with the FBI director at all. In fact, she might actually be more useful here, could try and follow Rael's advice to investigate outside of the box, could talk to people that usually might get overlooked, true to the motto, know your enemy before you defeat them, and no matter if Silver truly was their enemy, he definitely was and she couldn't believe she was quoting Alder on this, massive pain in the ass. Tally stopped and cleared her throat quietly, which made her partner turn around. "What's the matter, Craven?" "I think I will wait here." Alder looked at her with so much concern that Tally's stomach flipped. She smiled at her reassurance, hoping it would lift some of her worries. Her partner, however, still didn't seem fully convinced. "Are you sure?" "Yes, I'll probably be more useful here anyway." The tone of her voice seemed to indicate that she had actually thought this through and wasn't acting purely on instinct. Alder took one last, taxing look at her and then nodded. "Okay, I'm sure it won't take long." Then she turned around and followed Silver and Batan in the office, closing the door behind her. Tally was now alone in the room with the secretary, Mrs. Gibson, she remembered. She walked over to the armchair that was closest to the desk and sat down. After a moment of silence, she smiled politely at the secretary, who was still going through some papers, and started speaking. "Anything I can help you with?" Mrs. Gibson looked up from her work and returned Tally's smile. "Don't worry, dear. It's a quiet day. I'm glad I have something to do." "Yeah, I can imagine it's usually much busier here." "It is, but I'm glad I have this job, and I really enjoy it most of the time." She hesitated for a brief moment and mustered Tally. "I'm so sorry, but I didn't catch your name earlier. Detective..." Instead of pointing out that Silver hadn't even bothered enough to ask for her name, Tally still kept her tone friendly. "It's Detective Craven." "Right, Detective Craven. It's a pleasure to meet you." Tally continued, asking the women seemingly innocent questions. She seemed insecure, almost afraid to say too much, so Tally figured small talk was a good way to put Mrs. Gibson at ease, and would eventually offer her an opportunity to ask more important questions. So she slowly but steadily steered the conversation in the direction of Director Silver. "So have you been working for Mr. Silver for a long time?" Mr. Gibson nodded without any hesitation, and Tally was pleased to see she seemed to have warmed up to her. "Must be almost 35 years now." "Oh, wow, that's impressive. So you must have also known Penelope." She could see that older woman flinch at the mention of Silver's dead daughter, and for a second thought that she had moved forward too quickly. But then the secretary only smiled at her sadly and continued talking. "Yes, I've known her for almost all of her life. I spent a lot of time with the Silver family when they were still living in Salem. She was such a pretty girl, always polite and very quiet. Her death was such a tragedy. I can imagine it must have been very hard for the whole family. It has only ever been her and her father. Her mother died when Penelope was still very young, and as far as I know, none of the grandparents were still alive either." Tally remembered reading about that in one of the case files and took it as a good sign that Mrs. Gibson was actually being truthful with her, something one probably couldn't expect from Silver himself. "I see. That must have hit Mr. Silver especially hard then. His daughter was his whole world, and when she was gone, all he had left was his work. So that's what he focused on. If I can be very honest here, I think he moved on rather quickly, but I guess grief works differently for everybody." Tally looked up. Now that was interesting. "But he did get along well with his daughter?" "Oh, yes, absolutely. They spent a lot of time together, and he did everything to make her happy, until..." She stopped herself and hesitated. Still, Tally didn't miss the dark shadow that was suddenly lying over her face. Until what? The secretary shook her head slowly, visibly struggling with giving Tally a reply. You know, that's really not my place to say. I don't want to talk badly about Mr. Silver. He was a wonderful father. But Tally didn't plan on dropping the matter anytime soon. Instead, she looked at Mrs. Gibson insistently. Then don't talk about Mr. Silver. I only want to know about Penelope. Something about her changed, right? There was a brief pause. Then Mrs. Gibson sighed in defeat. There was a lot of insecurity in her voice, and Tally did her best not to interrupt the other woman once she started talking quietly. In the weeks before her death, she came around the office less often, and when she was there, I have heard her raise her voice at her father quite a few times. I've never heard her do that before. She had also changed a lot about her appearance. She'd started to dress bolder, had acted more rebellious. Her father wasn't really doing well with that. He kept telling me it was just usual teenage behavior, but I could see it was bugging him. Things got even tenser between them when she kept visiting that bar where she met all these people. She told me it was such a nice place, but her father really didn't like her going there. But that was probably because she told him that she... Mrs. Gibson stopped mid-sentence, suddenly realizing that she had already shared way more with Tally than she had planned. She blushed and busied herself with a stack of paper on her desk. Because she told him what? Tally tried again, desperate to get a reply out of the older woman without putting too much pressure on her. But Mrs. Gibson only shook her head. It doesn't matter, and it's honestly none of my business. If Mr. Silver hears me gossiping about his private life like that, he definitely won't be pleased. She almost sounded afraid now, and Tally backtracked. She took a deep breath and tried to make her voice sound soft and quiet. I understand that completely, and I won't tell Mr. Silver about any of this. Then she tested the waters again carefully. Can you at least give me the name of the bar? It would really help us a lot. Mrs. Gibson seemed to consider the question for a moment. Tally could see her struggling, but then, finally, she lowered her voice so that it was barely more than a whisper. Fort Salem. For some reason, that name rang a bell in Tally's head, and a sudden wave of adrenaline rushed through her. She knew she had read that name in one of the other case files before, but hadn't paid much attention to it. Now it seemed that she actually might have found a new connection between two of the victims. She cursed herself that she hadn't brought along the files, but she would definitely check them as soon as they were back in Boston. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And don't worry, as far as I'm concerned, this conversation has never happened. She smiled at the secretary reassuringly, and then leaned back in her armchair, letting Mrs. Gibson get back to work. Only a couple of minutes later, the door to Silver's office was opened, and Alder and Bataan stepped out. Tally could already see that the conversation had gone exactly as expected, and Silver had revealed absolutely nothing that was new, or of any help to them. The two detectives tried to remain a neutral expression on their faces, but Tally could see in the way that Alder was clenching her jaw just how frustrated her partner was. They quickly bid their goodbyes, and this time, Silver actually bothered to shake Tally's hand. Good to meet you, Detective. I'm sure we will see more of each other in the future. Tally managed to nod politely, but the words of Director Silver didn't really sit well with her. It sounded more like a threat than like a promise. She suddenly couldn't wait to get out of this building and let out a breath she didn't know she was holding as soon as the front door closed behind them, and they were back in the parking lot. Now that was a bummer. Detective Bataan didn't even try to hide how done she was. So nothing new? Alder jumped in, shaking her head slowly. It felt as if all that man did was recite his statement from the first time we spoke to him, word by word. He didn't even seem affected, as if it wasn't his dead daughter we were talking about. Classical sociopathic behavior, if you ask me. He also went above and beyond to make clear just who exactly he is, and what we would have to face if we wouldn't leave him alone. Goddess, that idiot can be glad he had an alibi for Penelope's death, or else it would be my pleasure to annoy him as much as possible. Right. Tally had forgotten about the alibi part. She remembered that Silver had been playing poker with 3 of his colleagues. It was far from waterproof, but the statement of 3 cops was definitely not enough to start a proper investigation, And frankly, Tally didn't know if a father would truly be able to kill his own daughter, especially without any obvious motive. Yeah, that man is definitely nobody I would like to spend too much time with. Tally shivered when she remembered his weirdly intense gaze on Alder. But our trip might not have been completely pointless. I might have found something, but I'll need to check the case files first. She seemed to have caught Alder's interest with that, but before she could start to question Tally, Detective Bataan interrupted them. Can we maybe talk about that over dinner? She mockingly curtsied in front of Tally. Majesty Craven, would you please do us the honor of driving us to a restaurant of your choice before my mood drops even further, and I walk back up there to punch that idiot in his smug face? Part of me would love to see that, but the bigger part really doesn't want to deal with all the drama and paperwork that would follow. Also, I'm starving as well, so let's go. The three grabbed something to eat at the nearby diner, and while they were eating, Tally filled the two other women in on their conversation with the secretary. However, neither Bataan nor Alder could remember where Tally had heard the name Fort Salem before, so that secret would actually need to wait until she was back in Boston with the case files. After they finished dinner, they all agreed that it was way too late to head back. They would arrive way after midnight, and none of them was looking forward too much to another 7-hour drive in a car, so they decided to spend the night in a nearby hotel. Once they arrived at the hotel, Alder immediately headed over to the reception to book them 3 rooms for the night, but even from the distance, Tally could see that it didn't seem to work out properly, and when Alder turned around, a slightly annoyed expression on her face, Tally's suspicions were confirmed. Alder walked over to where she and Detective Bataan were standing inside. They are almost fully booked, and the next hotel is definitely too far away. All that woman could offer me was 1 single and 1 double room. Detective Bataan let out a dry laugh. Well, isn't that wonderful? She looked at Alder with something in her eyes that Tally couldn't quite place. Now, there's no way that Detective Alder would voluntarily agree to share a room with me. There it was, that bitterness that made Tally wonder how close Bataan and Alder had been in the past, and she really didn't like that twisted feeling of jealousy that thought caused in her stomach. Detective Bataan, however, didn't seem to notice her hesitation and simply continued talking. I guess that means it's up to you, Red. Who would you rather take? She left a presumptuous pause that made Tally blush, and Alder rolled her eyes. As a roommate for the night. Tally quickly weighed her options. Spending the night in a room with Alder would definitely be a bit awkward, and filled with lots of gay panic on her part, but she was familiar with that feeling already. Plus, she was really getting used to spending time with Alder, even though it was usually in a much more professional work setting. The decision was basically made. She turned her head towards Alder and hoped she sounded more casual than she actually felt about all of this. Well, I don't think I can survive a whole evening of this. Tally gestured in Detective Bataan's direction. So if you're good with it, then I'd say it's you and me, Detective Alder. Alder only nodded, not letting the professional mask slip off of her face. Bataan, on the other hand, rolled her eyes dramatically. Shocker. She then quickly grabbed the key for the single room and headed towards the elevator. Tally hesitated for another brief moment and looked at Alder again, suddenly feeling insecure. I hope that's really not a problem for you. Alder only shrugged, still not showing the slightest indication of being anything other than fine with Tally's decision. Why would it be? Her words reassured Tally, and she allowed her brain to relax for a split second too long, so her next words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. Right, it's not like we haven't slept with each other before. Alder raised an eyebrow suggestively, and within seconds, Tally's head was bright red. Have I missed something? No, oh gosh, I meant the evening at the attic. Yeah, right, because that sounds so much more appropriate. Get a grip, Craven. We both fell asleep on the couch? Right. Then the voice of her partner dropped slightly deeper, teasing her. Because I think I definitely remember sleeping with you. The low chuckle that followed went directly to Tally's core, and she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm down her beating heart. Once she had managed to pull herself at least halfway back together, Alder had already snatched the key out of her hand and had followed Detective Bataan down the hallway. Tally awkwardly stumbled after her. Suddenly, she wasn't so sure about her choice anymore. It seemed that Alder would probably drive her even more crazy than Bataan would, only in a completely different way. But it would all be fine. She would stick to her boundaries, at least that's what she told herself. There would be plenty of space and no close contact between them. Or so she thought until she stepped into the room right behind Alder. She immediately froze and barely managed to conceal a frustrated groan when she spotted the large double bed in the middle of the room. Before she could panic, or Alder could address the issue in a more appropriate manner, she heard Detective Bataan snickering behind them. Now that's gonna be interesting. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.